Hi, everybody. Well, so much for the rain keeping people away. Either that, or you all have a lot of grievances, and that's so. Good afternoon, and welcome to Politics and Prose. I'm Brad Graham, the co-owner of the bookstore, along with my wife, Alyssa Muscatine, and we're very delighted to be hosting New York Times columnist Frank Bruni, who's here to talk about his new book, The Age of Grievance. Frank's distinguished career in journalism has covered a wide range of assignments. You know, often in the news business, a reporter gets on one track early and maybe switches to another one or two over the years. But Frank has had quite a varied and quite an accomplished run over the past 3.5 decades. He was a general assignment reporter for the New York Post, a movie critic, and a war correspondent in the Persian Gulf for the Detroit Free Press, and at the New York Times, which he joined in 1995. He's been a White House correspondent, a bureau chief in Rome, the chief restaurant critic, and op-ed columnist. His broad background has afforded him authority as a columnist on an array of subjects. 3 years ago, he stopped doing the columns full time and became a professor at Duke University, teaching in the School of Public Policy there. But he's still writing, of course, as you sure know. You know, he currently does a weekly newsletter for the Times and produces additional essays as one of the paper's contributing opinion writers. He's also written several previous books, including an account of his diagnosis with a disorder that imperils his eyesight, an examination of the college admissions process, a memoir about the joys and torments of his relationship with food, and a chronicle of George W. Bush's initial presidential campaign. Plus, he's co-written a cookbook, A Meatloaf in Every Oven. In his new book, Frank explores and really laments how a pervasive obsession with grievances has come to dominate our politics on both the left and the right. You know, grievances, he writes, are employed to win arguments, to build support, to assign blame, to win sympathy and sympathizers. You know, it's true, as he notes, that grievances can at times be good. And they have, in fact, led to some of the greatest social reforms in U.S. history. After all, the U.S. itself is a nation born of grievances, as Frank says. But nowadays, you know, and this is Frank's main point, grievances are getting piled up on top of one another, amplified by social media and taken to extremes. And the result has been an erosion of civility and of the sense of compromise that's necessary for democracy to function. Frank makes a really compelling case about the danger of all this grievance mongering. And like so much of his writing, the book, which by the way has made the New York Times bestseller list, is lucid, it's pointed, it's deft, and very engaging. So I urge you all to read it. And then please stop whining. In conversation with Frank today, it will be another very talented journalist, Olivia Nuzzi, who's currently the Washington correspondent for New York Magazine. So please join me in welcoming both Frank and Olivia.
Hello, thank you all for showing up here, and thank you, Frank, for having me do this.
Thank you for saying yes.
Yeah, of course. I would say yes to basically anything you asked me, I think.
We'll test. So we're starting off on a, never mind.
Not like that. Well, congratulations. Yet another fabulous book. You know how much I love your work. It's your big grievance is how many grievances seem to motivate all of the rest of us.
No, my big grievance is I don't get to see you often enough. But then there are the other ones, yeah.
What was the moment when you realized that this was a central problem animating our politics and our society?
It's hard for me to pinpoint, but again, thank you for doing this. Thank you all for being here. I'm really, I'm so flattered. Thank you. It's hard to say one point, but I keep on flashing back to some degree on the pandemic, right? And I remember back after 9/11, how when that happened, in the weeks after that happened, for a while, we actually saw President George W. Bush with approval ratings that were north of 80%, north of 85%, I think even a few times north of 90%. And they stayed up there for a number of weeks because this thing that affected everybody, that threatened everybody in American life, had happened. And we did what you would expect a healthy country would do. And we kind of put our differences aside for a little bit, and we kind of banded together with shared interests and with a common purpose. And I remember when the coronavirus pandemic began and when it became clear pretty quickly, what the scale of the thing could be, how universal the threat of it was to people's health, et cetera, I thought, we're going to see at least something somewhat similar. And in fact, we saw the exact opposite. And when that happened, I thought, I don't think this is just a quirk. I think this says something about how the country has changed in the years between those two incidents. And that was maybe somewhat of a crystallizing moment for me.
How do you think it affects how we all relate to each other? You talk a lot about in the book media and being a part of a media ecosystem that. Oh, yep. Is that better? Can you hear me? I'm a low talker, I've been told. You write a lot in the book about the media ecosystem, how we're all so polarized, how opinion is extraordinarily popular, and the most successful opinions, if you look at a lot of any news website, are often ones that have a very strong take, a very simplistic take. Well, I guess first, how do you feel about being a part of that faction of our media ecosystem, and how do you deal with not being a part of the problem that you're talking about in this book?
Well, I feel very conflicted about it, and I think sometimes I am part of the problem. No, I mean, I do, but I think I also try to correct for that at other times, and maybe be a tiny bit a part of something like a solution. But I've been conflicted from the moment I started writing opinion. And I do worry that so much of we talk a lot about social media, and those things are pretty kind of self-evident and obvious. The way in which everyone sets up their social media feeds, and then by dint of algorithms, gets corralled into ever narrower ideological enclaves, and then gets kind of trapped there. I mean, I think we're all familiar with that, and we know what that has done to us. But I think we too seldom note what's happened with traditional media. And in an almost European way. I worked in Italy for a year and a half. I was the Times' Rome-based person. And Italian journalism, most Western European journalism, every publication kind of came from a certain viewpoint, and you knew that, and you read it knowing that. And it seemed different from here. I think that difference has become less stark over time. We have seen in this era where you can measure very, very well, and almost on a minute-to-minute basis, you can measure what your audience is doing digitally. We've seen that people like to write opinion more than news. You've seen opinion sections expand, including at the New York Times. If you go to the Times' trending list, right, at any given moment, our opinion section, in terms of the number of people who work for it, in terms of budget and all that, is probably less than 1/6, 1/7 of the editorial operation. But if you go to that list on most days, most moments, maybe half of that list, sometimes 2/3, are opinion pieces, right? It turns out that we all like to read opinions that don't, and we like to read ones that don't challenge ours, but that affirm them. And in the same way, you can use social media to curate an information and news environment of your choosing. You can do that actually with traditional media and with kind of digital readership as well. And I think that too has had an effect. And I know I'm part of that. I try sometimes, not often enough, to write things that maybe are a little bit outside the box of what someone might expect from me. I try frequently, and I do this in the book at some length, to hold up figures in the political world who are consensus builders as opposed to confrontation, as opposed to being like what I would call grievance entrepreneurs. I mean, you've got grievance entrepreneurs. Like I hope we have many different viewpoints here, but I feel like there are certain names you can mention and not offend anyone. So I'm going to go with Marjorie Taylor Greene.
Should I have not invited her here tonight?
Oh, is she coming? Oh, sorry. Well, maybe she'll teach me some CrossFit moves. I could use it. But we have.
What was the phrasing? What was she called in Congress? It was But
Built speech.
we'll all get into a rhythm repeating this by the end of tonight. Yeah. Hi. Box died. Box died. Badly built. Butch body.
It was admirably alliterative, you know.
It was beautifully rendered.
Yeah.
I will say
Yeah.
that.
I mean, okay, let's
Sorry,
since
she's a grievance entrepreneur, is what you're
yeah.
saying.
So I have tried both at the Times, and I'm not the only one, and certainly in the book, to write about politicians that try to do the opposite. You know, and it's interesting when people say like, "Where's the hope? Are we just kind of hopelessly becoming a nation of extremists on both ends of the spectrum?" It is interesting to note. I'm hardly the first person, or even the second, or 15th, or 1500th to note it. But if you kind of look back a couple of years ago at who the most which governors in this country had the most consistently high approval ratings, those governors included or were Charlie Baker in Massachusetts, a Republican governor in one of the bluest states in the country, Larry Hogan in Maryland, same deal. And then on the flip side, you have extremely popular Democratic governors in red states, Andy Beshear, you know, for one very kind of prime example. It tells me that there's an appetite out there for conflict resolution, for consensus building, for compromise, which is not a dirty word, that is bigger than our election results sometimes suggest. And that kind of is an enormous reflection of how broken our primary system is.
You were talking about Marjorie Taylor Greene, though, as a grievance entrepreneur. Can you talk a little bit about what that type of person is and what their function is in our society?
A grievance entrepreneur is someone who knows that in a country where the currents of anger run stronger and stronger, and where partisanship and polarization become more and more intense, that if they pick fights, if they vilify and demonize the other side, if they make clear that if they basically come out in the public square and say, my enemies are the same as your enemies, watch me torment them, right? That is a grievance entrepreneur. It's interesting, whatever else you thought about him, if you go back and you look at Ron DeSantis's campaigns, and especially his campaign for president, in a kind of flip of the Republican vision of a Ronald Reagan, so much of what he did is identify the people who were his and thus his supporters' opponents in his view, and like kind of one by one, as if kind of checking off a list, figure out how to torment them. That prosecutor in Tampa who dared to say he was for abortion rights, you're gone, right? Disney, Mickey Mouse, I'm putting you in the stockade. And no, but on and on, it was like a checklist. And it was just interesting because it was so negative. And when you think about that, like, how do you govern in the wake of that? How do you, the day after the election, say that I'm everybody's governor or I'm everybody's president if you've spent so much of your campaign, regardless of what office it's for, basically saying I'm going to hate on the people you hate even more than you do, and I'm going to make them as miserable as you want me to.
There's something sort of poetic about the fact that he was laughed out of the Republican primary then and kind of bullied into this meme that calcified about him, right? Trump, where does Trump
the problem
fit in?
is he was trying to out-mean the king of mean,
Yeah,
right?
you can't do that.
Yeah, I
It
mean
doesn't work.
he was playing a game that somebody had won long ago, and
Yeah.
and that somebody is going to be the Republican nominee.
Where does he fit into this broader story of our grievance culture?
Donald Trump?
I said he, like he's
Well, I
our
mean,
ominous overlord.
To
yeah.
kind of almost finish the Ron DeSantis thought, I mean, I think that answer is 4 words long. I am your retribution. That is such a distilled and perfect statement of, here's what's going on. You don't like the people who I also don't like. You feel looked down upon by. You feel condescended to. You feel left out of the discussion, vilified by the same people who dislike me. Vote for me as a way of giving them the middle finger. I am your retribution. I mean, that's grievance incarnate.
None of this sounds good. It sounds like we're in a pretty bad place as Americans. Do you feel optimistic at all? It doesn't seem like there's any impulse to get out of this.
I think there is. So, I mean, to go back to the politicians I mentioned a little bit ago, I do think there's an impulse to get out of it. I think there are structures and there's a sort of system and there's a status quo in place that retards it. But
I
I
don't think you can say that word anymore. I'm just kidding.
as a verb you can.
I'm kidding. I'm kidding. But you have a very funny part in the book about you had some phrase for it about the list of bad words, about the no-fly list for the semantic no-fly list.
Well, I
is what you
talk
said.
about, I mean, I'm glad you mentioned that because I think it's important to say this. I mean, I talk about what I see as the excesses of grievance on the left as well as the right. And I think one of the most difficult things about talking about that, or one of the most difficult things for me in writing about it in the book, is I think it is only honest and crucially important to note that this grievance culture exists across the political spectrum. But at the same time, I think you can't do a false equivalence or both sidesism. You have more organized political violence on the right. You need to say that. Right. You have a pervasive and a profound strain of election denialism leading to the grievance prom of January 6th on the right? So you need to note the behavior everywhere, but you also kind of need to be proportional and reasonable about where it has caused the greatest harm and where it poses the most threat.
What I thought was interesting reading the book, you describe, I think it was Marianne Williamson who said that large groups of desperate people are a national security risk. But I was thinking they're also just a risk in general to like a healthy society. So you describe all of these trends, people not being able to pay their rent, inflation, college becoming more expensive, inequality in general, income inequality worsening over the last decades, and almost just like this stressed out mob of Americans banging into each other and arguing over every little thing. Can you describe, I guess, how all of that works and how you assessed those trends?
Well, we're seeing how badly it works, but you just mentioned a couple of things I think are vitally important, which is we no longer have the degree of social mobility that we once had. And that is a real problem in a country whose mythology is constructed around that, and whose idealism is constructed around that. We also don't have, you talk about people bumping into each other, we also don't have the same belief in the future. And I think a lot gets said, a lot gets written about what social media has done to divide us, and it has done a hell of a lot to divide us. I don't think any of that is exaggerated one whit. But I think sometimes we don't recognize and reckon with how pessimistic we've become and what an enormous change in the American psyche that is and what that does to us. If you don't believe that the country's future is going to be brighter than today or than the past, if you don't believe the economy can steadily grow, and on, you have a totally different relationship with your neighbor and with the people around you. Maybe not your neighbor, but if you see this all as a zero-sum game, then every time you measure how you're doing, you're measuring it against how somebody else is doing. You believe that somebody else's gain is your loss. And it has pitted people against one another in a way that, you can see the effect of that in our public discourse, which that phrase doesn't even sometimes seem to rightly apply to what the conversations or what the shouting is like.
Right. You're talking about how siloed things are, and you can kind of choose your own adventure with information, and you end up in this little bubble that you've constructed and that the algorithm has constructed in part for you. And it seems like people are just so disconnected that they don't really have to be confronted with someone else's humanity anymore. Right?
No, and we often, and it's not just online, online's the worst version of it, but even in terms of where we live physically, I think the frequency with which we cross paths with people who are not from our same socioeconomic background, people who are not from our same political proclivity, that's becoming less and less frequent. And it means we end up seeing each other in abstraction and in caricature. And I have some fellow journalists in the room that I've seen, some good friends, and I'm sure they'll shake their heads. They'll nod their heads when I say this. But a really interesting thing happens when and you probably had this happen to you a million times, so I'm curious. You write something, you get the hate mail in your inbox, and we get plenty of hate mail. And for some reason, maybe once with a couple of people, you respond. And the minute you respond, what happens? What do you get back from that person? If you respond reasonably,
I don't respond that much to people being mean.
Okay, well,
to me.
I respond quite a bit, and the minute
oftentimes people are just, they fold and they're oh, sorry, I didn't mean to say it like that.
Right, but they fold because now you're a human being.
Yeah.
Like, you've written back to them, you've said, I'm sorry you feel that way. This is how I feel. And all of a sudden they're like, oh, I didn't mean it, or I didn't mean it quite like that, or it's so nice of you to respond.
Or even an apology.
Yeah.
Sorry, I was just angry
Right,
about
right.
something that you said, right?
Well, so there's a real important lesson in that. The minute you're not a caricature, the minute you're not an abstraction, the minute they realize there's a flesh and blood person there who is more than just the sentences that he, she, or they wrote, but is someone who can feel hurt, somebody who can choose to show courtesy, and on, they are suddenly able to have a conversation with you that they couldn't otherwise have. That happens too infrequently in American life because of how sordid we are in so many ways and across so many different fronts.
We're talking about the media. Obviously, we talked a bit about the Marjorie Taylor Greenes of the world. There's a story towards the beginning of the book about Alito, Justice Alito. Can you explain that story and talk a bit about that? And I was thinking about it in light of the news that he's been flying the American flag upside down outside of his home.
Yeah, he did that for a little while. Well, of course, he didn't do it. His wife did. Right? Here's what I want to know.
It's so gross to blame your wife for anything.
Here's what I want to know. Before he threw his wife under the bus, did he ask her if it was okay? Like, did she have any say in the bus going over her and backing up a few times?
I hope they're not in communication today. I hope she's very mad.
No, but I mean, you read that story and you think, how can that be a Supreme Court justice? But if you've been paying attention for the last couple of years, it almost feels like the logical conclusion of the story. Alito in particular, and this is what I write about in the book, and I stole this in part from a column from my dear friend, colleague, and who I want to be when I grow up, Maureen Dowd, who's somewhere here.
Yeah.
But Maureen, yeah, don't shake your head.
Hi.
As I quote Maureen on, I think, on page 6 or 7 of the book, and Maureen, it should have been page 1 or 2, I apologize. She said the Supreme Court right now is the greatest collection of grievances you've ever seen on the Supreme Court. And she used that word because that word gets used more and more, and that's a tell. That's part of the story here. And Alito has been going around for years giving speeches at black tie dinners at conferences that are of an extraordinarily pointed, partisan, and angry nature that you would not once have thought a Supreme Court justice would give. I mean, these Supreme Court justices, they have lifelong appointments. They occupy what is, or until recently was, the most august station in American life. What you don't expect from them is anger, peevishness, and spite. And that's what you increasingly get, and that is emblematic of where we are as a country. After he wrote the majority opinion overturning Roe v. Wade. So take whatever you think about the decision off the table. You have to know, he's an intelligent person, that is going to divide the country. That doesn't mean that you don't do it, but you have to know that. You have to know there's going to be a lot of blowback. There's going to be a lot of lamentation and whatever. And he says to the Wall Street Journal, oh, it's just terrible, the things they're saying about us, and nobody's defending us. Woe is me from a Supreme Court justice, right? I mean, there's nobody in our society anymore who doesn't seem to recognize that seizing the role of victim, that saying woe is me, it's like this currency that everybody wants to avail themselves of. In that same section of the book in the beginning, I talk about Will Smith's Oscar speech and something that didn't get said that much. So, we all remember he goes on the stage, he violently assaults Chris Rock. I mean, that's what happened, right? 5-10 minutes later, he wins the Best Actor Oscar for King Richard. He goes to the stage. He does not apologize at that point in time. But if you go back and you look at his speech, what's fascinating is he actually asks you to feel sorry for him. He actually gives an aggrieved speech. And what he wants you to feel sorry for him for is that when you are a rich, powerful celebrity, people say whatever they want about you and you don't have recourse. Wow. Will, I'll take your mansion and your riches, and I'll take all of that bad stuff too, I mean, but again, what he recognized smartly is that there is this strange, perverse currency in our country, in our society right now, for someone who can paint himself, herself, themselves in a given situation as the victim, as the wronged party.
It's interesting because it seems like people are angrier than ever, they're more vicious than ever, but they're also more sensitive than ever.
Yes.
How do you reconcile those ideas?
No, it's like it's an era of mass immaturity,
Well, you've written a lot about higher ed, so can you talk a bit about that?
I mean, I want to give a counter take about higher ed. So you said earlier, and I'm glad you brought it up, and I didn't do justice to it, like, is there any reason for hope, right? Do I have any optimism? And I will tell you, some of my hope and optimism comes from higher ed. Are there many students who are woke social justice warriors of the type that you read about in the kind of most mocking and exaggerated news stories? Yes, yes. They are not all the students. They are certainly not all of my students. And I have found two things that give me great hope in the classes I've taught. I always say at the beginning, you know, simply as a matter of like education, simply as a matter of betterment and as a kind of bid to make our country a better place, I want you to be clear. I want to be clear. This classroom is a place where any kind of viewpoint, all ideological diversity, anything shy of hate speech and disrespecting your classmates is not only allowed, it's encouraged, right? I bring in guest Zoomers, guest speakers who span the political spectrum. I mean, some of whom are almost even a little bit provocative. I have never had a student complain to the dean. I have not been canceled, at least not as of a few minutes ago. We'll see, I'll check later. And I have found more students are kind of psyched for that than not. And I've also noticed something else, which is students want one thing above all else. I mean, no contest. It's called an A, right? um, and if you basically send the signal, the way to get an A from me is to kind of challenge your own convictions, to listen hard, especially to the classmates who don't say exactly what you want them to say. Shocker of shockers, they tilt in that direction because they want to please you. So we have that ability, you know, to kind of point people to a more civil society. But again, they have been much more open than you would think they would be from media accounts. And the other thing that encourages me is when you talk to students about, okay, what news are you reading? What does your social media setup look like, your feed? If they realize that without necessarily intending it, but because of just kind of happenstance and then the algorithms and all that, if they realize how incredibly monochromatic, monocultural, et cetera, their information feed is, they're open to changing it because often it's something that exists not in alignment with what they intended to happen and not in alignment with what they see as their best self, but it just kind of happened and nobody paused. Nobody asked them to pause in the course of their education and think about what they were doing and think about how they could tinker with it. They're willing to tinker, and that gives me hope.
You're talking about people who have an incentive, the A, to develop a more nuanced worldview, or at least hear people with more nuanced opinions. If you have a lifetime appointment, or you're being rewarded repeatedly in our culture for extremism or for being a jerk, how do you fix that? Do you have any ideas?
We have to change the incentive structure. So, like, let's talk about extremism. There are political reforms that we can commit ourselves to, that we can push for much more aggressively than we have, that would tamp down extremism and that would reward something else. I wish I could remember which of my colleagues wrote it, and I feel bad that I can't. But 4 or 5 weeks ago, there was a terrific and I thought really hopeful and encouraging story in the Times about what's happened in Michigan over the last 5 years and how it went from a state where, in its particular case, the out of whack Republican dominance of the state did not actually match the political sentiments and the leanings of the population. And when you looked at the various things that changed, that took Michigan away from what was essentially minority rule, it was all citizen-led. It was all citizen pressure. It was all voters deciding, if we band together efficiently enough, if we care enough, if we push hard enough, we can actually change this. Well, that doesn't need to only be Michigan. And that, if we could make those changes elsewhere, it would change the incentive structure that encourages extremists. I mean, that's one thing we can do. There's a lot more we can do. We can do so many things that we know are good, but we just don't put our weight behind. We need to talk much more seriously about and advocate much more strongly for some sort of national service program, right? Because that is one of those ways in which we can push back against the sorting of people in society. Most people hear that and they think that'd be great, but nobody is going to go for compulsory national service. It doesn't have to be compulsory. You can build in incentives. You can build in rewards, GI Bill type rewards that would, I think, end up attracting enough people that I think it would begin to kind of like grow on its own. It would become voguish, for lack of a better word. It would do enormous good. We can do things when we design communities that prioritize bringing diverse people together as opposed to keeping them apart. When you're placing a public park, you can put it as a bubble in a homogeneous community, or you can place it so that each side of that park faces a slightly different community, and the people coming in, hopefully with their dogs, like my Regan, are going to
Great dog.
actually...
America's best dogs, I think, Regan. She's so cute.
Olivia has spent time with her. So I just always like to give her one shout out per event. So that's the Regan shout out.
She's watching the live stream, I think.
Oh, yeah, I hope so. Yeah.
Well, I would vote for you. Are you running? You have some good ideas.
I don't have skeletons in my closet, Olivia. I have a graveyard. So no, I'm not running.
I think that's actually a plus now. It seems to be part of the criteria.
It would certainly
for
make
running.
for one great inaugural news conference, right?
Well, let's talk about 2024. How does all this factor into presidential politics, and how do you see it in the current election?
I think one of the ways it's factoring in is both candidates have the temptation to spend most of their, I was going to say oratorical energy, but in all fairness, the words oratory and oratorical don't seem to fit this campaign quite that well. But I mean,
you didn't like Trump's Gettysburg Address?
Is that the one where he went on and on about Hannibal Lecter?
That was a different one.
Okay,
No,
I know. I'm just still reliving that. I wrote about it the other day, but what really aggrieves me is I'm a real Silence of the Lambs fan, and I just don't want it purposed like that. I think what you're going to see, what you've seen in this campaign, what you're going to see more of, I think it's a big decision for Joe Biden to make, is you're going to see campaigning that is not remotely idealistic, that is not about like, here's the positive I plan to do for the country, here's where I think we could improve, here's my precise recipe. You're going to see a lot of this campaign devoted to, if you don't vote for me, you're getting that, and that's unsurvivable, that's unsustainable. I think the problem is if both sides go all the way in that direction, what happens again, like at the next day in terms of the governability of the country? I mean, we know that we should worry that if Trump loses, or perhaps I should say, if once again the election is stolen from him, I mean, we have to worry very much about another January 6th or something even worse. There's going to be a kind of rejection of the legitimacy of the results that is absolutely a product of our grievance culture. And one of the things I hope President Biden does is that he comes up with a proportion. It is important for him to say to the people whom he's trying to get to vote for him, it is important and legitimate for him to say, listen to some of what Donald Trump has said about what he plans to do with the country. Do not ignore that. Think about that. But I hope he spends a fair amount of time sounding a positive note, and presenting a positive vision, because I think that would be the starkest of the contrasts. And I think it would be wise, but it would also be better for the country on the day after the election.
What would the positive vision that Trump could be talking about on the stump sound like?
Well, I don't think it's going to happen, so I don't like. But I mean, like if you take his tone, I mean, to be really, really fair, if you take his tone out of the equation, right? Unfortunately, it takes everything to these dystopian and apocalyptic levels, but it's fair to talk about immigration policy. It's fair to talk about a porous border. You can talk in a positive way about wanting to bring a coherence, a sense, the right kinds of limits, the right kinds of justice and fairness to the immigration process. That's a fair and a conversation you can have in a positive way. It's not the manner in which he chooses to have it.
I would say that's definitely true. There's a passage from the book that you wanted to read. Can you?
Oh, right.
Yeah.
I don't know if I wanted to, but no. And then we'll go to.
I was briefed. I
What?
was told you wanted to.
No, I wanted to talk about one other thing that's happened in our country in terms of the service economy that I think doesn't get as much attention as it should, and that I think is a big part of Grievance. And so, yeah, I'll read this. When I was a teenager in the late 1970s and early 1980s and went to the big concerts of major performers, different sections of seating had different prices, but they fell into a few general categories. A person's proximity to the stage often had less to do with her financial reserves than with how quickly and heroically she'd acted to get her tickets. I once showed up at the box office of what was then called the Hartford Civic Center at 3 a.m. in pitch darkness to be in place when tickets for a Queen concert went on sale several hours later. That was the surest path to the best seats. My friends and I ended up in the 8th row where I caught Freddie Mercury's tambourine when he threw it into the crowd at the conclusion of the band's final song. And there was something egalitarian about that. But the seating maps for various stops on Taylor Swift's 2023 tour revealed scores and scores of price tags, tailored with extreme specificity to the precise desirability of the vantage point. The highest ones were many thousands of dollars above the lowest ones, a family of 4 or 5 posting photos of themselves among other ecstatic Swifties as showtime neared, was in some cases announcing to the world its ability to drop $10,000 or more on one night's entertainment. But while the price range for Swift exceeded the price range for a garden variety superstar, the exacting tiering of the experience was a common phenomenon in the world of live music. When I was a teenager, school essentially came in 2 sizes, public or private. Now, private is the starting point, with many costly but broadly applied add-ons: the tutors for special subjects, the separate tutor for standardized exams, the individual sports coach, the independent college admissions consultant who, for a hefty fee, does more plotting and pacifying than the counselors already on the school staff are able to. When I was a teenager, you were posh if you belonged to a private gym versus, say, the YMCA. The brand of that gym and the level of your membership weren't relevant. Now, Planet Fitness and Equinox are solar systems of pampering apart. And at some of the equinoxes of the galaxy, different clients pay significantly different sums for personal trainers in accordance with that ab whisperer's determined gradation of expertise. Those clients can also pay a surcharge for a better locker room, a surcharge for certain other sanctums. And none of that is unnoticed by or unnoticeable to the other customers. Its noticeableness is perhaps part of the point. Aspiration and perspiration go together. The emphasis of the American economy may have changed over the years from manufacturing to services, but one product we make in abundance is distinctions.
That was great.
I think we don't talk. I don't think we kind of pause to realize and talk as much as we could about just how tiered the service economy is, just how many and specific the microclimates of exclusivity and privilege are.
Yeah, I mean, in writing about just this culture where everyone is sort of annoyed all the time and angry enough to fly off the handle if something pushes them a little bit, you were talking about a family going on vacation and having to bear witness as the more privileged family gets to kind of glide through the airport,
Right.
step onto the plane, leave with their special privileges, go to Disneyland with special privileges, and then all of that, it seems, builds up until I don't know, you're yelling at people on the internet anytime you're offended by something,
or fighting with them on the plane. I
Yeah.
mean, I remember the good old quaint days of road rage. Right now, we have air rage, we have retail rage, we have restaurant rage.
I'm from New Jersey, so I still have road rage primarily.
Yeah, but you're really not letting yourself. You're not spreading your wings if you're not going into the other kinds of rages. But it's not just. I mean, listen, we've always had inequality, and then we've always been aware, that there are people who are living better than we are. I think, though, that the kind of degree to which the variety of the ways and the degree to which that's flaunted now, I think is pronounced and different. And then of course on social media, like once you've done all these things, once you've gotten the genie pass at Disney so that while somebody else is sweating for 3 hours on the line to Space Mountain, you're just zooming up to the front and going on. Then you put it on social media, right? They've seen it on social media, nobody on Instagram, on TikTok, wherever, everybody always seems to be at a wedding in the tropics, raising and clinking champagne glasses while the sun sets behind them, right? Nobody puts on Instagram or TikTok themselves in their bed at 7 p.m. because the day was horrible and they're surrounded by the detritus of the too much buttered popcorn that they ate while they cry themselves to sleep because someone just broke up with them. That's probably as common a scenario as the wedding in the Caribbean, but you don't see it on Instagram or TikTok or whatever,
We should probably go to questions soon. There are microphones, or there's one microphone right here, so if you want to start lining up, right there. Thank you for reading that. That was great.
Oh.
Okay. So when I hear talks like this, I feel very, very old. I was born in the 1940s, and I watched all of this happen. I remember when the country was quite different. And this will sound like a 1960s conspiracy theory, but you don't talk about how this came about. The Republicans, I remember in 1980 when Ronald Reagan took over, I remember the Nixon administration and the Southern strategy. The Republicans were not popular. Their program was tax cuts and deregulation. Nobody cared about that. We cared about the New Deal. And when Reagan came in, it was the Southern strategy. You needed that job. That was a commercial for a Southern senator running against the black mayor of Charlottesville, I think.
Do you have a question?
Yes. Do you talk about that? Does that make sense to you? That this is really all about corporations and money. And the excuse they give for the fact that people are not living as well as they did when I was growing up. It takes 2 salaries to support a middle-class life with no childcare.
Thank you. Frank, do you have a response?
I don't think it's all about corporations. I think some of it is about corporations. I think this is something that has happened. I think there are so many streams feeding this river. I think some of those streams are the ones you mentioned for sure, but I think it's much, much more complicated and varied than that. But the other thing I would say is it is absolutely the case that in a lot of situations it takes 2 incomes to do what 1 income used to do. It is also the case that there are many numbers that suggest we're actually living at a more blessed time than we often realize. And one of the ironies, and I discuss this irony in the book, is in fact, by certain historical yardsticks and measures, we're not living in a terrible time at all. But we've decided to look only at the terribleness. In the last year, I think it was the last year of his presidency, it might have been the last 18 months, when he wasn't worried about re-election, when I think he became an always reflective man, became even more reflective. President Obama went to Hanover, Germany, and gave a speech that gets quoted a lot. And he said at that time, and he wasn't campaigning, so there was no percentage in saying, here's how angry you should be, like, et cetera. And he said, if you had to choose any moment of history in which to be alive, and if you had to choose any country, any place in history in which to be alive, you would absolutely, there'd only be one choice to make, and it would be the United States right now. That does not mean we don't have grave, grave problems. We do. But when I listen to you or in general, I worry that we spend so much time telling ourselves that we're miserable and we're being denied all of this stuff, and we need to work on making life better here without forgetting for one moment how blessed we are.
President Obama was too young to remember.
Thank you.
Frank, thank you very much. I want to ask you about consensus politicians. I hope you're right about that. A little bit of background. I'm an ex-reporter. I covered Watergate for 2 years for the New York Daily News. I never felt as pessimistic then as I do now about the fate of the democracy. That having been said, I will also say I finally came to accept reluctantly Jerry Ford's pardon of Richard Nixon. I'm curious about your opinion of the Mitt Romney just recently saying maybe Biden should pardon Donald Trump. I mean, it was a kind of a blow to me, but I said, well, let me think about it, and I'm curious about what your views might be.
I don't know. I was riveted by that same thing as you. I don't think he said he should do it now. I think he said he should have done it. Yeah. And I'm sure that question has come up before, and it's dumb of me that I hadn't thought of it or read it some other place, because I'm sure it has been hashed out at least a little bit somewhere else. I thought it was a fascinating notion. As a matter of political strategy, I thought, that might really be so. As a matter of sort of sending a signal to the country about the direction in which you want it to go, it might have been. But I haven't thought about it enough, and it's complicated. And I always want to be, I mean, this is part of my pushback against Grievance. I always want to be comfortable when I don't know saying I don't know, and I just don't know. But I think it's a fascinating discussion and idea.
And neither do I. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi. A week or so ago, your colleague Nicholas Kristof,
who's going to be here, I think, at 7, so stick around,
said that if Trump wins, the country is resourceful enough and has enough resilience that it will survive. What do you think?
I'm going to give you another one of those really frustrating I don't know. I understand why he says that. I'd like to believe that. I just really, really don't know. I think a lot of, to be really, really candid, the past 8 years have challenged a lot of my fundamental assumptions about the country, and about taking our democracy for granted. We forget that we really haven't been at this in a historical sense that long. How many people have seen one of my favorite movies? If you were putting one movie into like a kind of time capsule for someone to see 500 years from now that would tell them what was America like, I would choose the movie Nashville. How many people have seen the movie Nashville? Oh, good, a lot of people. And it's kind of long and it has its weaknesses, but I love the way that movie begins, and it has that character Opal, who I think is representing the BBC, and she's walking around with her tape recorder and her microphone, narrating what she's seeing. And she stumbles upon a recording studio where Haven Hamilton, I think is the character's name. He's the king of Nashville. He's played by Henry Gibson. And he's singing his new hit song, or he's recording his new hit song. And the song's chorus is, "We must be doing something right to last 200 years. Nashville came out in 19... And of course, it's hilarious because it's just 200 years, right? We just don't know we're doing something, and it's another thing we don't say to ourselves often enough. We're doing something, when people say the American experiment, it's a very appropriate phrase. We're doing something in this country that we can't look back in history and say there's proof that it works. We're doing democracy, and we're doing diversity on a scale that's never been, to a degree and on a scale that's never been attempted before, that runs counter to some of human beings' most tribal nature. It's what makes this so exciting and precious and glorious, but it also means we can never take it for granted. And so the answer is, I don't know, but I know we shouldn't take it for granted, or the possibility that we won't be resilient, I think, grows if we take it for granted.
Thank you.
Bella.
Hi, Professor.
How
Bruni.
are you?
Good. How are you?
This is Bella Larson, and when I was putting together this book, I decided to do a little bit of kind of double dipping, or what's the right word? Multitasking, not really efficiency. And I taught a course called The Age of Grievance. And I taught it again this past semester, but we upsized it, and
Nice.
Bella was in that class. It is so nice to see you.
Good to see you too. Thank you for being here. I'm wondering if in your investigation of grievance, and now 2 classes on grievance, if you found yourself becoming more or less aggrieved in your personal life, and
Great question.
also.
Well, did I seem aggrieved when we were teaching? Okay.
No. And also, I am wondering how you keep grievance out of your own writing.
Well, I'm sure there's some. It's a great question. Thank you. See, Duke students, they're really, really terrific. I'm sure I don't. But part of the problem is, how are we defining grievance? There's some. I think there are complaints that pertain to matters of justice and things we need to get better that you have to put in. I think grievance is increasingly used in a pejorative and negative connotation because those complaints have metastasized and proliferated, and the legitimate is mixed with the illegitimate, et cetera. So I think there are grievances in the most traditional sense of the word in things I write. I just hope I'm never overwrought. And I say hope because I'm sure that I am overwrought at times. But I also try not to do something, and again, I'm sure I don't succeed, but it's something I wish all of us would do more of, which is not to take one prism and apply it to every situation, right? For instance, we need to fight against racism because it's real, it endures. We need to fight against homophobia, sexism. There are situations where we cry racism, homophobia, sexism, where it doesn't exist because we're so accustomed to that prism, we like it so much, we're so attached to it, and it ends up eroding our credibility when we need to sound the alarm really loudly, and it ends up inviting people who don't want to hear it to tune out. So I don't know if this is a direct answer to your question, but that's something I try to do more and more of, not to just kind of look and take out the handiest prism, the one I've used before, and say it's what reveals the truth here. Because sometimes that prism is exactly appropriate, and sometimes it is just pure hackery.
Thank you.
Thank you.
feel like I just got my answer, but I'm curious of your view on Black Lives Matter. That is an event of grievance. Do you see it as divisive? What do you think of it?
I mean, it depends. I mean, I think the movement is important, and I think what it's trying to fight against, how it's trying to improve the world, is entirely just and important. There are situations in which people, I hate to, we got to be careful about generalizing. When you have a couple of people or a chapter, I forget the exact measure, of the Black Lives Matter movement within days after October 7th, appropriating the symbol of a paraglider as something good, that's a problem. I mean, that's a couple of people are a part of the movement that is going in a direction that is not constructive for anyone and is not quite fair. But it's a big movement with a lot of people, and so it's kind of, are there instances in which I think people in that movement have done what I'm talking about by taking a prism and using it even in situations where the prism or the lens don't belong? Sure. Do I think that movement is ultimately about something hugely important? And do I think probably the bulk of the people involved in it are fighting for something that is just and necessary? Sure. It's complicated.
Hello. I was born in Eastern Europe during the 70s. I was born in Romania. So when I look around and I see all this bleakness, it feels very reminiscent of the context in which I lived my childhood and adolescence. So that, on the one hand, gives me hope, because that's a system that ended. But my question to you is this. Sometime at the beginning of the 1990s, after the fall of the Soviet Union, Francis Fukuyama declared the end of history. And so many smart people bought it. Democracy had won. It was a one-way street. There was no going back. The European Union was expanding without having any clauses in the agreement that would enable them to remove countries that became a problem. So this belief that we can only be on a single trajectory, that there is no going back, that we had won, that we reached the finish line. And now we're finding that we didn't, and we're so despondent, so depressed. What are we so depressed about? I mean, the 90s were the exception, and the early 2000s. If you look at history, that was the exception, not the norm of how history taught us.
Right.
We should, think of it with respect, right? So now we're in this position where we feel that we have lost, even though, as Obama was saying, if you were to pick a country. And as someone who is a dual citizen, I can tell you that I don't regret the decision of moving here, even though, the reversal of Roe v. Wade grieves me. I know women who lost their lives because of back alley abortions, right? Because that was the norm in my country. So I just feel like I'm so angry with my fellow, Democrats for feeling that they have lost when the fight just keeps going.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I'll just say something quick, and then we should go. We got to wrap it. Yeah. It's interesting you mention the end of history. I mention it in the book, but I also no, because you're right, because there was this moment in the 90s, which I think in retrospect was a moment of overconfidence, false confidence. But it's interesting because a couple of years ago, of course, Francis Fukuyama wrote a follow-up called Liberalism and Its Discontents, which was a very kind of chilly and abstract title or whatever, but that book is basically one big oops. But it's an intelligent oops, and and the answer is we can never take anything for granted. The answer is even if you believe, the arc of history bends toward. I always get that saying wrong. It's why I write and I don't do public speaking, because I can't get anything right when I'm
bends towards justice.
When I'm extemporaneous.
Right?
What?
It bends towards justice.
Bends toward
right?
justice. Yeah. I mean, that's a real jagged zigzag of a line, right? And so I think we just have to be really, really careful about ever saying, okay, we've won. I think the minute you say, okay, we've accomplished it, we've won, everything's perfect, is the moment it starts to unravel. I think the work never ends.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And
One more, quick, very quick.
Is it a question?
Quick question.
Okay.
Because this is my feeling about it. We won World War II. It created a kind of feeling about democracy which was extraordinarily positive, winning. We've lost every war since. And I'm curious what you think the effect of Vietnam, Iraq, all these wars which we've gone into and failed have cost us the kind of uniform positiveness that is now prevalent with all this, discourse that we have.
I don't want to. I don't have enough time to give the answer that question deserves. So I'm going to punt, and I apologize. But I don't want to give you some glib one-sentence answer, and I do want to save time to sign books and all that. But thank you for your observation.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here. Thank you, Frank.
Thank you, Olivia.
And thank you for writing this wonderful book. I hope that you all buy a copy. And I'll see you when you do your next book.
Thank you very much. Thanks.
So copies of Frank's book are available at the checkout desk. He'll sign up here. Please form a line to the right of the table, but don't fold up your chairs.
Yeah. I can't do justice to it. You want me here?
Yeah, right here.